Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. Let's extend a warm welcome to Professor Hengchen Dai as she joins us on our podcast. Professor Dai, a faculty member at UCLA Anderson School of Management, specializes in judgment and decision-making research, focusing on using data analytics to boost employee motivation and customer engagement. She also co-directs the UCLA Health-Anderson Nudge Unit, applying behavior science to enhance clinical quality. Before UCLA, she taught at Washington University's Olin Business School. A senior editor for Organization Science, Professor Dai collaborates with various organizations to conduct field studies, aligning her work with Los Angeles dynamic tech and business sectors. She has published extensively in leading journals across science, management, psychology, marketing, and medicine, including Nature and Academy of Management Journal. Her accolades include the Association for Psychological Science Fellow, Janet Taylor Spence Award, and multiple research awards like the Robert C. Cialdini Prize. At UCLA Anderson, she teaches across executive, fully employed, and full-time MBA programs, earning recognition as one of Poet and Con's best 40 under 40 MBA professors and the Dean George W. Robbins Teaching Award. Dr. Dai focuses on helping students applying research insights to real-world experiences. Dr. Dai holds a Ph.D. in Operations and Information Management from the University of Pennsylvania and a BS in Psychology and BA in Economics from Peking University. In this episode, Professor Dai will share valuable insights from her research, behavioral nudges, how small changes can drive big impact in organizations. Professor Hengchen Dai, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Hi, Deepak. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Professor Dai, can you start by explaining what behavioral nudges are and how they differ from traditional methods of influencing behavior in organizations?
It's great. Yes. So behavioral nudges refer to the subtle changes in the way choices are presented or information is presented that can influence people's decisions systematically without restricting their options. And behavioral nudges leverage insights from behavioral science to promote better decision making in a variety of areas, such as employee productivity or health, citizen engagement, education, and financial well-being, just as a few examples. And the traditional methods that we're more familiar with often rely on mandates, incentives, or penalties to drive behavior change. In contrast, nudges reshape the way choices are presented. And for example, we can automatically, right, as a very famous example, we can automatically enroll employees in a retirement savings plan with the option to opt out. That would be considered as a nudge versus offering financial incentives for enrollment. That would be considered as a traditional approach.
Yeah. How can organizations effectively implement nudges to improve employee productivity and engagement? Could you share some real-world examples?
Yes, totally. I will share a few examples that I really like, but obviously there are a lot of more options for the audience who are interested to check out later. So first one I want to talk about is a paper that tests the effects of loss aversion framing. It's done by Tajim Hossein and John List. In this research project, they collaborated with a factory in China, and then they randomly assigned whether or not incentives for performance are described in a gain framing or a loss framing, right? So in this case, the incentive itself is objectively kept the same, but it's framed either as something you can gain, or if you don't reach the certain performance, then you could lose the bonus, right? And they find that the loss framing leads to a higher productivity, and more precisely, they find the magnitude of the effect is about 1%, in a sense the team productivity is enhanced by 1% purely due to framing it from a loss angle rather than a gain angle. So that is a very classic example of leveraging a fundamental principle about human psychology, the fact that people are more aversive to losses on average, and then try to increase productivity without changing the basic incentive per se. And here is another example by my academic siblings and my academic advisor, so Anish Rai and Katie Milkman, as well as Edward Chan, Angela Duckworth and Marisa Sharaf, they looked at how to change the framing of goals and how that would influence employee, or more broadly speaking, people's goal pursuit. So in a field experiment, they find that if you frame an overarching goal of, say, 200 hours of work into more granular sub goals, like either 4 hours of work every week or 8 hours every 2 weeks, that leads to better engagement, right? I want to clarify their specific context is not employees' productivity, but rather they were looking at volunteer behavior. So that's why it's possible to do 4 hours of work. Clearly, it would not be possible for a regular employee. But the basic idea, I think, applies to employee productivity as well. So instead of showing people a daunting goal, you could help break it out, provides this. It may seem to be more rigid, right? There's less flexibility. Every week now you have to do 4 hours, but this type of sub goals make things seem less daunting and can increase engagement when employees are asked to sign up for something that may seem challenging from the beginning, but this type of nudge can make it seem more, more increase their self-efficacious in terms of being able to contribute to such type of program. So that would be another example. It's about how we can present goals. And then the third example I will give is by Professor Yana Gallus, who is my dear friend, co-author and a colleague at UCLA Anderson. She has a very clever field experiment with Wikipedia, where encouraging editors to contribute their free time and edit those articles is a big challenge. And she varied whether or not editors receive a symbolic award. Again, in this case, it's not a financial incentive. It's not a monetary incentive she's providing, but it's a symbolic award. It's really just a badge on the editor's page. And she found that when the editors were randomly assigned to receive this type of symbolic award, it increased their subsequent activity and retention with Wikipedia, which I also think has great implication for organizations that are trying to encourage or improve employee engagement and productivity, particularly in settings that involve those service or public good contribution.
Professor Dai, nudges can be powerful, but how do organizations ensure they are used ethically, particularly when influencing employee decisions or behaviors?
That's a great question. There are a couple of thoughts. Excuse me. There are a couple of thoughts. One is I think the right goal and the intention really, really matter, right? So it just make me think about Professor Rachel Thieler's point, like we want to nudge, not sludge. We don't want to trick people so we can get them fall into a trap and then behaving in a way that benefit organization or marketers rather than thinking about what is the long-term benefits of employees. So I do think the goals are important. Nudges should aim to benefit employees rather than solely advancing organization's goals. Obviously, it's a balance, right? We want to care about organization's bottom line, but at the same time, when you have happy employees, when you have healthy employees, those are the employees that will also be productive and stay with you for a long time. So you want to aim to benefit employees. For example, sending reminders about using vacation days so people get the proper breaks. That would be a good nudge that help ensure employees maintain a healthy work-life balance rather than figuring out a way to trick them so they would overwork, right? The other thing is the choice. Don't constrain the choices, right? The nudges should not overly pressure employees into a certain behavior. The goal, again, is to make the desired option, the options that could benefit employees in the long term. Those options, you want to make them easier, more salient, and help people recognize that is the option that many other people choose rather than restrict the alternatives. So I think those important checks and balances have to be in place.
How can organizations tailor nudges to fit different cultural or organizational context? And what factors should be considered when customizing these interventions?
It's another great question. I definitely have a lot of failures from my own research that I can share that are lessons, hard lessons I learned about the importance of tailoring nudges and customizing it. But I also have a successful example from my colleagues and friends to share as well. So one point I want to make is, yes, it's very important to consider the context, the culture, because people draw inferences differently about the same intervention, depends on their cultural background. So you have to recognize the exact context where you implement intervention, the exact way you implement intervention really matter, because people try to make sense of why something is presented to them, why the choice environment looks differently. So I will give first a good example. So it's an example from my colleague, friends, and co-author Sherry Wu at UCLA Anderson. She conducted a field experiment with a Chinese factory, and the Chinese factory wants to reduce waste. So in this company, in this factory, workers are working on the assembling line. They put together like clothes, and then there was a lot of fabrics that don't need to be used and put on the floor. And then it's costly for companies to actually later on clean it. So they were trying to reduce waste. And the idea she come up with is to put golden coins on the floor, the golden corn decals on the floor, based on the local workers' belief that gold coins can protect fortune and luck. So that nudge itself is already designed based on the beliefs of the targets of the nudge. And then she also talked to the managers to understand what even make the nudges more effective. And then she get the insights from the manager that they actually need to go to a local temple. They need people in the temple to actually put additional protection on the golden coin. And so then people would believe, wow, that the golden coin has been blessed by the temple. Then they would feel even less willing to throw trash or waste on the golden coin. So that's again leveraging the wisdom from people working in our organization, and also to further leverage people's deeper belief. In this case, you could say it's a superstition, but it is an important contextual factor you have to consider. It effectively reduced the waste on the floor by over 20% when the coin decals were installed and blessed by the temple. So that would be one example. I think a successful example of taking into the context in terms of how we design nudges. Then the second example I'll give from my own research, where I did an experiment with Joey Rave, who was a former PhD student at Anderson, now is a faculty member at University of Maryland, as well as Yana Gallas, who I mentioned earlier, a professor at UCLA Anderson. We did a field experiment across 7 countries using 6 languages, testing a marketing technique we call impact appeal. The idea is companies often encourage employees and customers to provide feedback. And we noticed that a common way that companies encourage feedback provision is to highlight that employees or customers can provide, their impact can make a big difference. And in our survey, it seems like managers deeply believe this is going to work. It's going to make customers feel or employees feel they can be efficacious. They are going to provide more voluntary feedback. However, we find that when we try to tell customers of this technology company that they could shape the future direction of the company, they could help shape the customer experience by providing a feedback, on average, this backfired. It actually reduced people's willingness to provide feedback relative to using a very straightforward subject line, just telling people, we request a feedback. And the most important part is the effect varies hugely across the 7 countries. For Japan, for example, it leads to a significant, substantial decrease by about, I think, 4 percentage points in people's willingness to take survey. But in China, in another country that you would think is more similar, quite similar to Japan, actually you find a positive increase about 2 percentage points in people's willingness to respond, because they got our impact appeal subject line. And so what drives this huge heterogeneous treatment effect? Like in America, it's also a negative effect of 2 percentage points. So we think one possibility is trust, is to what extent people tend to trust business. And we find subsequently, we find additional data that tells us the level of trust in business across culture Japan has one of the lowest average trust in business. China have one of the highest levels of trust in business on average. And then if we plot the level of trust in business across the 7 countries, it aligns reasonably well with the effect size we observe, such that countries with higher trust in business tend to show more positive effects in response to impact appeals, versus countries with low trust in business tend to show the negative effect in response to impact appeal. And we have some subsequent lab experiments to replicate this pattern and confirm that indeed those perceptions about authenticity, about the manipulativeness of those nudges or those communications based on psychological principles would vary based on the level of trust you have in business. So that another example where context really matter. You have to understand how people think in general about business, their suspicions. So when you try to implement nudges that people are aware that you're trying to influence them, right? You could get different results, depends on the context. So that's another example. And then the third thing I want to mention in terms of what organizations have to be mindful of is unintended consequence. Okay, it could be good, it can be bad. So often when we implement nudges, we're so eager to measure performance, right? Who doesn't care about bottom line? Of course, first thing we check is how well employees perform in response to nudges. But in some of my research, we have found, well, there are additional things you want to check, which could either help you recognize the nudge is not working as well as you thought because there are negative unintended consequences, or it could lead you to realize you underestimate the power of nudges. There are positive unintended consequences. So I want to give you an example about each. So let's start from the negative side and end on more positive notes. On the negative side, in another project with Joey Riff and Yana Gallus, they are my repeated co-authors and partners in crime. So we did a field experiment with UCLA Health. That's the hospital affiliated with UCLA that I'm working with. So at UCLA Health, they have an incentive program. They want to incentivize physicians to achieve high clinical quality, have high patient satisfaction, for example. So as part of their incentive program, we conducted a field experiment and we varied the performance feedback that we send to employees. Leveraging social norm is a very classic nudge, right? So basically you tell people how their peers have been performing and provide those peer comparison information has been repeatedly shown to be beneficial, to actually motivate people to perform in line with their peers, improve their performance if they are below the average in particular. There has been some settings where peer comparison backfire, but they are backfire for different reasons. They may backfire because, for example, you realize you're already much better than your peers, you have complacency effect. But that's not what we find. In our case, when we tell people how they perform relative to their peers on a single metric that UCLA Health as consider as very important, that is the preventive care score. That is, what's the percentage of your patients completed those preventive care service that UCLA Health and the best practice guidelines consider as very critical. Okay, that is a single metric. It just measure the percentage of patients that complete the preventive care service that they should. Okay, so we send out emails. We varied whether or not doctors are told about their performance relative to their peers. We put them into different buckets based on whether they're the top performer, they're the high performer, they're near high performer, and they're at the bottom. We thought it's going to work based on the literature. However, it did not change doctors' performance. If anything, we actually were surprised to find it make them less satisfied with their job and also increase their self-reported burnout. And we were only able to find those results because we included some additional measures beyond performance. So in addition to measure performance, we pre-register, we're also going to explore some secondary outcome that we consider more as balancing metrics, just to see whether there are emotional outcome or like well-being outcomes that could be inadvertently affected. And we're glad that we are one of the few studies that have had the opportunity to assess outcomes beyond performance, so we can test in this context, actually burnout becomes a negative outcome. So it really draws a cautious note that we want to think about the outcomes we assess, not just the bottom line, but something that has a long-term implication for employees' happiness and performance. And then just to understand why it backfired, we did some additional analysis. It's really exploratory at this point, since we did not hypothesize it's going to be a bad outcome. So we explored the best explanation we have goes back to your question about context, about culture. It turns out in this context where people care about pro-social, like doctors care about helping patients, right? And UCLA Health has been talking about communal care. Like we want to be collaborative. We want to create this culture that highlights collaboration. It seems to contradict the idea of let's compete, let's compare with each other, seems to contradict with that image. Like let's care about the communal care, collaboration. That's one thing. The other thing is it doesn't feel appropriate to highlight just a single metric. Doctors feel like it's very simplistic to just have a reductionist to focus on this one metric that seems to define who they are, define whether they are a top performer. And so that gives us some broader lesson. When you implement an intervention you thought it kind of worked in the literature, and in fact, my colleague Craig Fox, Professor Craig Fox, and his co-authors has shown peer comparison works when it comes to reducing antibiotics. Doctors would reduce their prescription of inappropriate antibiotics when they were told they are the bottom 10 performer for this metrics. And he finds no downstream consequence for burnouts when they see our paper and then they later on do subsequent analysis. They did not find a decrease in job satisfaction. And we see there's some important context difference. Antibiotics, very clear. It's a single metric, appropriate to go ahead. Versus in our case, there's so many metrics to define clinical quality. Why specific this one? And also in their context, everyone can become top performer as long as you stop prescribing inappropriate antibiotics. In our case, how do we even define the best performer? It's unrealistic to expect everyone to get 100% compliance because they're doing something out of their control. It's something their patients have to comply with. So there's a lot of contextual difference that make it hard to simply grab something from the shelf that has worked in the past. So you really have to understand your context, understand the appropriateness and the inferences people draw, and then assess a broad set of outcome rather than just performance. Would you still be interested to hear the positive example, or I realize I've been talking a lot about the specific points? I will let Deepak to decide what is the best way to move forward.
Yeah. So let us go to question number 5, and then we will come back again.
Perfect.
Yeah. Beyond productivity and ethical behavior, what other areas within organizations can benefit from the application of behavioral nudges, such as employee well-being or diversity and inclusion?
Totally. There are so many examples to pick. Again, I will only be able to pick a few to highlight. So since you mentioned diversity inclusion, I want to give a couple of quick examples here. So one is research done by my colleague Joyce Herb and her co-authors. They actually take the idea of a default and then implement in an EDI context to try to increase females' willingness to join competition, right? So if we think about the pipeline, why there are fewer female managers, one reason could be, well, those promotions often require some sort of competition. You have to opt yourself into those competitive contexts, get yourself to be considered for promotion. And the literature suggests females are less willing to join competition, even when the performance are equal as males. So in her case, she bring the idea of default, and she find that if you have an opt-out system, where everyone who reached certain performance bar would be automatically considered for a promotion, for a more competitive job. And they can opt out if they don't want to. Like with this opt-out setting, she find that females end up being more likely to be considered for promotion and for competitive jobs, in comparison to cases where you do the traditional opt-in process, where you would have to actively indicate you want to be considered. You have to actively sign up for the promotion process. So I think that is a very clever implementation of the opt-in, opt-out process and moving it from other contexts to EDI setting. Another example comes from Edward Chan and Erica Kurgos and Katie Milkman. They looked at different ways to present and consider candidates, whether you are considering candidates simultaneously for multiple job openings, or you are only making decisions about one job opening at once. And they find that if people, as hiring managers, if you are considering multiple job openings at once, review candidates together, they are more likely to produce a short list that's more diverse. Because it forced them to consider a greater number of, they would start to realize, right? Oh, there are 5 positions, but I only have all females or all males or all whites, right? But versus when they are making isolated choice for one job opening, they are less likely to become aware of the lack of diversity in who they select for a given position. So that would be another example of in the diversity inclusion context. In terms of the well-being context, I will cite my own research example for the financial well-being. I have a paper with John Bashir, Katie Milkman, Shlomi Benenzi, where we look at fresh start framing. So some of my earlier work examines the effect of fresh starts on people's motivation. And fresh start are moments that stand out in your life that opens a new era, a new period, like the beginning of new year, new month, new week, your birthdays, your work anniversary. Those moments start a new period in your life, symbolically, right? So in our research, we find that when we highlight a future opportunity for people to sign up for their retirement savings plan, and then we connect that future opportunity in relation to fresh start dates, such as the employee's birthday or like the first day of spring. In those cases, we make people more willing to sign up for the retirement savings program in comparison to not connecting the future date with a fresh start moment. Like, for example, if we just tell people, sign up in 2 months, would you like to pre-commit to sign up in 2 months? People are less willing to do it than if we say, would you pre-commit to sign up for 2 months later after your birthday? So I think that's another example where you subtly change the framing, but you leverage some known psychology about when people are more motivated to think about their long-term well-being, in this case, financial well-being. And there are also examples about vaccination where, like in my research, during the COVID, I conducted large-scale experiments with UCLA Health, where we vary the content of reminders we send to people, and we find that those type of ownership language, telling people a dose has just been made available to you, claim your dose at UCLA Health. This type of language can motivate people beyond a simple reminder, and this insight is also consistent with earlier work by Katie Milkman and her MEC study showing that those type of language, like a dose is waiting for you, or a dose has been reserved for you, it seems to be effective. This psychological ownership language seems to have been shown to be effective in increasing vaccination across contexts.
Very insightful. Dr. Dai, how can technology such as AI and data analytics enhance the design and delivery of behavioral nudges in modern workplaces?
Yes, I'm excited to talk about this question. I have a few thoughts. So the first one, I think, is personalized nudge. I think that is something a lot of behavioral scientists and people who work in this space are excited about. And with AI, with data analytics, right? So one, use machine learning, you might be able to uncover into how you can uncover heterogeneous treatment effects across contexts, across subpopulations. So we can test who for whom, when a given nudge would have the best effect, right? So that insights would allow you to better personalize nudges So that would be one idea. And also personalized nudges could be empowered now with AI, with this large language models. Those models will also be able to tailor nudges to individual employees based on their preference, behaviors, work patterns, or based on some communication those chat has with individual. They would understand, oh, those are the specific barriers this person has in terms of engaging in some beneficial behavior. So I can try to target and persuade them based on the barrier the specific employee has, right? So that would be another way we personalize nudge, leverage AI based on what the AI knows about the individual. So that's one direction. I think the other direction is I think technology also helps with scale interventions, right? A lot of the interventions in the past have been tested either like in the lab setting, in online experiments, or with field experiments in a very like research manner, rather than actually with organizations, natural setting, when people may not necessarily engage with the intervention naturally, right? So the technology may help to make it possible to deploy nudges at a scale, reaching larger and diverse workforce with lower manual effort, but also it may help engage employees with those interventions, right? Not only deploy, but also help engage them. Again, because for example, chatbots may be more engaging to talk to than just the bi-directional text that has been used in the past to implement some intervention. So it's possible chatbot will help enhance engagement with intervention when engagement and attention are limited resources. And also I think AI can help with more real-time feedback and adaptation, right? Like currently when we write intervention, we write it one time and then a few months later or maybe a few weeks later, we check the results. Okay, maybe we iterate if the company is willing to work with us again. We try again, try a different version with a different sample. But I think AI allows more real-time or dynamic adaptation based on employees' reaction and feedback, and can that type of adjustment, I see that can be a future. And another thing coming back to like data analytics is maybe I will take this opportunity to go back to an example that I was briefly setting up earlier, is how to more effectively assess the impact of nudges. So in one of my paper is actually in collaboration with digital entertainment platform, where we allow users to send nudges or reminders to content providers that have not produced anything for a while. So basically on this digital entertainment platform, you can think about users who are viewers of those content, user-generated content, and then people who are producers who actually generate those content. And then the viewers can actually send nudges to content providers, right? And the nudges are simple. Basically things like, oh, I haven't seen your video for a while. I would love to see new video. So it's really symbolic as a way to express their expectation for future products or their gratitude for the videos that the content provider have produced in the past. And okay, so not surprisingly, we find that when viewers can send those type of nudges, content provider produce more videos. But what is very interesting is we then find that the content providers are also, when they receive a reminder themselves, they are also more willing to nudge other people, because keep in mind, those content providers themselves are also viewers of other people's video. So now when they are nudged, they are willing to pass along the nudge. Now they actually also send out reminders to other content reminder, which creates this ripple effect. So if you only analyze the first stage outcome, oh, if you receive a reminder, what is the outcome? Then you would only be able to estimate the primary results based on the performance per se. But if you realize that create a cascading effect, that would allow you to more accurately estimate the impact of nudges. And then where the data analytics play even bigger role is in our case, we actually can see based on the network ties. So we bring some network literature here, and we looked at different network characteristics to find out in what case people are more likely to create this cascade effect. And then we can set up a network model. We can do simulation. We can actually more comprehensively estimate the global effect of these nudges. by considering not only the first stage effect, but also second stage and the cascading effect, by considering the network structure. And that is enabled by advanced data analytics and simulations. So I think that's another angle where technology and data analytics can play a role, is help us better understand the channels via which nudge work, and then better estimates the overall effect. And then finally, I think technology also makes it possible to integrate nudges into the everyday workflow, right? So instead of doing something that requires manual effort, now it can be better seamlessly embedded into existing tools and systems, increase adoption. Like, for example, if we think about those electronic health records, in the healthcare context, there is more advanced tools nowadays can be included into the clinical setting because of the technology.
Professor Dai, my last question. What is the one key takeaway you would like listeners to remember about the power of behavioral nudges in driving organizational impact?
Yes, I think I what I'm gonna say is gonna be longer than one sentence, but the key thing I think is just one takeaway, that is transferability across contexts is very important to keep in mind. The devils is always in the detail. So don't just assume, like, take something off the shelf that behavioral scientists said that have worked across settings and assume it's necessarily going to work in your setting, assume it's going to work for the specific implementation that you have, because your subpopulation, the trust level may differ. And also in some of my research, I find that the baseline motivation of a given population really matter, whether you already have some intention to engage in like vaccination or preventive care versus you do not have any intention at all. The intention have to be established. That also influence what type of intervention you should use. So you really have to understand the culture, the trust, the customer's baseline interest, and how they would make sense of the intervention you implement. So do some small pilots and focus group, engage the target audience first, rather than take something from an existing toolbox. It's really devil is in the detail.
Thank you so much, Professor Hengchen Dai, for joining us today and sharing your invaluable insights from your research, behavioral nudges, how small changes can drive big impact in organizations. We have explored how principles of behavioral economics like nudging and choice architecture can be applied to improve productivity, foster ethical decision making, and create positive change in the workplace. Thank you once again, and we look forward to having you with us next time. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for having me. It has been a wonderful conversation.